The newly released DHS footage finally shows what happened in the tense minutes before the shooting involving Renee Nicole Good, and the sequence begins with an unexpected traffic maneuver that reportedly changed the entire dynamic of the scene. At first glance, nothing looks unusual, but then comes the moment where Good parks her vehicle sideways across the road, creating an obstacle that agents reportedly could not easily bypass. It's a detail officials are now referencing as a key factor in explaining how a routine operation turned into a high-stakes standoff. What's most intriguing is how the scene unfolds without raised voices, dramatic gestures, or the imagery we often associate with confrontation. Instead, the tension forms quietly, through positioning, timing, and uncertainty, and that's exactly what investigators and analysts are now scrutinizing. The video begins with what DHS described as a normal approach, with ICE vehicles moving at a controlled pace. There's no initial visible distress, no sudden acceleration. Everything feels orderly, almost procedural, but within seconds, the dynamics shift. Good's vehicle enters the frame and stops in a way that appears to limit the corridor of movement for federal agents. According to DHS statements, this placement impeded the operation, though officials have been careful to avoid making definitive claims about intent until the ongoing investigation concludes. What makes this moment particularly notable for analysts and for the public is the contrast between the slow pace of the vehicles and the rising stakes behind the scenes. You can almost feel the questions forming. Why stop there? What message does that send, and what options did agents have in those seconds? Without creating judgment or assigning motives, what we do know from publicly available information is that ICE vehicles slowed to a crawl as Good's car remained positioned across the roadway. Allegedly, the agents attempted to assess the situation from inside their vehicles, likely calculating next steps while also waiting for clarity. Then comes the subtle escalation. Not verbal, not physical, but logistical. A small detail, yet with meaningful consequences. When a street becomes blocked, timing changes. And timing, according to law enforcement experts, is often what defines the difference between a routine operation and an evolving incident. This is where the newly released visuals provide context. Not definitive answers, not conclusions, but context. The kind investigators seek, and the public too, especially when a case has drawn national attention. But what happened next is where the story becomes even more complex. Because the video doesn't just show a roadblock. It shows the beginning of an interaction that multiple agencies will now dissect frame by frame. And the biggest question still remains unanswered. At what point did this stop being routine? The Department of Homeland Security stated that the purpose of releasing the footage was to provide additional transparency about the environment agents encountered that morning. The agency noted that the scenario reportedly shifted rapidly, though officials have avoided offering conclusions while federal investigators continue their review. Meanwhile, the FBI has launched its own investigation into the circumstances surrounding the shooting. That alone signals the seriousness with which this incident is being handled, and also reflects standard protocol when force is used in operations involving federal agents. But there's another layer. According to reporting from the Associated Press, state-level investigators have not yet been granted full access to certain evidence. That detail has prompted questions from legal analysts concerning procedure, collaboration, and jurisdiction. None of these questions imply wrongdoing. Rather, they highlight the complex overlap between federal and state investigative frameworks. This complexity, logistical, legal, and procedural, is part of what keeps public interest high. Yet the coverage around this incident has taken noticeably different tones across different outlets. Some focus on the footage itself, others on the investigations, and others on what this incident may mean for future operations. But one key issue still stands out, and it's not dramatic. It's structural. Why did a seemingly low-tempo approach escalate, and how do investigators determine where escalation truly begins? That question is now driving much of the analysis. From a viewer's perspective, the early part of the video feels almost anticlimactic. Vehicles move slowly. No one appears to be shouting. No visible physical confrontation occurs. Yet officials argue that these seconds matter precisely because they are uneventful. They show the baseline from which the situation evolved. Experts in de escalation training often point out that incidents rarely shift due to a single dramatic act. Instead, they evolve through a series of micro decisions: where a car parks, how close vehicles get, how long agents wait before attempting communication. Each choice is informed by safety protocols, perception of risk, and available information. In this case, Good's decision to block the roadway introduced a new variable, whether intentional or not, and investigators have not made any claims regarding motive. The effect was the same. The operation could not proceed as originally planned, which reportedly forced agents to reassess. This reassessment is the invisible part of the story. The part the public never sees but that investigators outline in post-incident reports. Not because it's dramatic, but because it provides context: what was known, what was assumed, and what was possible in those 3 minutes before the shooting. And here's where things get even more layered. What appears straightforward on video might not match what agents say they perceived in the moment. And perception, legally and procedurally, often shapes the narrative as much as the footage itself. When experts analyze law enforcement footage, they often look for timing. How long did each phase last, and at what point did the scenario begin to shift toward uncertainty?
In this case, the DHS release highlights a roughly 3-minute period before the shooting. 3 minutes may sound brief in everyday terms, but in operational decision-making, it is substantial. It allows for assessment, communication, and protocol-driven steps, but also introduces the possibility of conflicting interpretations. During this interval, observers note that the ICE vehicles briefly paused, then slowly repositioned as Good's car remained horizontally oriented across the lane. To viewers, the scene may look restrained. To investigators, the orientation of the cars reportedly represents a tactical challenge. Nothing in the video shows aggressive gestures, and the footage, as released, does not include audio. This absence adds another point of interest. Without sound, context becomes visual and spatial rather than verbal. Analysts must focus on movement, distance, and timing rather than tone or dialogue. But analysts aren't only asking what happened, they're asking why the footage was released now and what question the release is designed to answer. Publicly, DHS stated the release was intended to offer clarity about what agents encountered just before force was used. In communications from federal officials, the emphasis has been on the phrase "provides context," rather than on conclusions or direct justification. That linguistic distinction is intentional. Investigations are ongoing, and federal agencies generally avoid definitive statements until reports are finalized. Media coverage, however, often amplifies whichever angle is most newsworthy at the time. For some outlets, it's the video itself. For others, it's the tension between federal and state investigators. And for others still, the human element: who Good was, how the community is reacting, and what this means for future operations. Yet woven through all of this is a reminder that the incident is still under review, and claims being circulated are often prefaced with terms like allegedly, reportedly, or according to officials. This protective language keeps coverage grounded and avoids transforming speculation into fact. The unanswered questions don't just linger, they stack. What did agents perceive? What options did they consider? And how will investigators reconstruct those moments without audio? While the FBI's involvement reinforces the seriousness of the incident, the Associated Press report that state investigators have not yet been granted full access to evidence introduces a procedural puzzle. Why the gap? Legal experts note that such situations can arise when multiple jurisdictions intersect, especially when federal agencies assert control over materials until certain stages of review conclude. This doesn't imply conflict, rather, it underscores that the mechanics of investigation can be slow, especially when federal protocols and state-level inquiries overlap. Public perception often defaults to delay, but in practice it may reflect a structured sequence established to prevent compromised evidence or conflicting investigative paths. Meanwhile, advocates for transparency have focused less on the footage itself and more on the timeline of information release. They argue that earlier releases could have reduced speculation, while federal officials counter that premature disclosure risks misinterpretation before all investigative steps are complete. These debates are not explosive, nor are they framed as accusations. Instead, they fit within a broader national conversation about how use of force events, especially those involving federal agents, should be communicated to the public. And that brings us to a different kind of question, not about the incident, but about the system surrounding incidents. How should the public learn about federal operations, and who decides when information becomes public? One of the most compelling aspects of this story is how uneventful the footage initially appears. There are no flashing lights, no visible disorder, and no audible confrontation. For some viewers, this absence of high drama visuals is surprising, especially when compared to the intensity implied by headlines or public discourse. But the quietness of the footage may be precisely why DHS chose to release it, to show that, according to officials, the pivotal decisions occurred not in chaos, but in stillness. Operational experts often note that quiet incidents are sometimes harder to analyze than loud ones. When there is no shouting, no immediate threat signal, and no overt aggression, identifying escalation points becomes more interpretive and less obvious. Investigators must now piece together several layers of data: the video, agent testimony, forensic analysis, and timing records. Each layer informs the others, and discrepancies, if any, become the focus of inquiries, not because they imply wrongdoing, but because they help reconstruct a factual timeline.
And yet, even with footage, timelines, and agency statements, one aspect remains unknown to the public. What intent, if any, can be inferred from Good's decision to block the road? Officials have not assigned motive, and investigators may ultimately conclude that intent cannot be definitively established. But even the absence of a clear motive can shape the narrative, reminding audiences that not every high-profile incident produces simple answers. Beyond the investigative dimension, there's another part of the story unfolding: the community response. Public reaction has been measured but engaged, with national and local outlets tracking developments as new information emerges. There are no widespread protests, no large-scale demonstrations, and no polarizing rhetoric dominating the conversation, at least at this stage. Instead, the tone is one of inquiry. What led to the incident? How will investigators assess it? And what policies, if any, might be influenced by the findings? Civil liberties organizations have framed the case as part of a broader discussion about accountability and transparency in federal operations. Legal commentators, meanwhile, have focused on process, how multi-agency investigations work, who oversees them, and how long findings typically take to become public. The absence of sensational framing has kept the discourse more analytical than emotional, allowing room for questions that don't demand immediate conclusions.